Okay, so we've seen how the price of a good can have an impact on the quantity demanded of that good, and we've seen how consumers' income can also have an impact on the quantity demanded of a good. But what we want to look at now is the impact of a change in the price of one good on the quantity demanded of a different good. This is called cross-price elasticity of demand. And why would that be important? Who cares? Well, if we thought about it from the perspective of business, a particular firm, then if it's true that the price of different products can impact on the quantity demanded of the product that you're selling, then that would obviously be useful information to have at your disposal. Because if other firms producing different products change their prices such that there is for example, a fall in the demand for your product, there will also be a fall in the revenue that you earn or acquire. So it's important to know what kinds of relationships hold between the prices of certain products and the quantities demanded of the product that you might be endeavouring to sell as a business. You might want to know, are there other firms out there which are producing a rival product? Change in the price of rival products will impact on demand for your product. But it's also possible that there might be firms out there who are producing products which are complementary to the product that you're producing. That is, that where consumers regard the product you're selling and the product being sold by another firm as goods that go together. So cars and petrol obviously go together, they're complementary. In order to enjoy the benefits of the car, it's necessary to buy the petrol. Toothbrushes and toothpaste, obviously, in order to enjoy the benefits of the toothbrush, you need to buy the toothpaste, and presumably vice versa. You can think of your own examples of goods that are complementary, and also goods that are substitutes, alternatives, or rivals for each other. So, how do we measure price elasticity of demand? Well, as we've done with all the elasticities that we've looked at, we start with a cause. The price of good A, measured as a percentage, has an impact, perhaps, on the quantity demanded of some other good B, measured as a percentage. It's the responsiveness of the quantity demanded of good B to the change in the price of good A that we're interested in here, and we represent it usefully by a ratio. We're going to call that ratio the cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient. You should be able to guess why it's called cross-price elasticity of demand. We're crossing from one market or from one good to a different good. The price of one good to a different good. So here's our ratio. Let's say the price of good A were increased by 10%, and as a result, the quantity demanded of good B increases by 3%. We've got a coefficient of 0.3, or in other words, because that 0.3 is implicitly over 1, in other words, a 1% increase in the price of good A leads to a 0.3% percentage increase in the quantity demanded of good B, a different product. So the price of good A and the price of good B are positively related or directly related. Or, for example, we might have an increase in the price of good A by 1% leads to a 5% increase in the quantity demanded of good B. A coefficient of 5. Again, this is a positive relationship. What must be the nature of this relationship? How do these goods stand in relation to each other if we have this kind of price-quantity relationship? Well, we would say that these two goods are very, very likely to be substitutes. That is, they're alternatives for one another. When the price of Mars bars increases, consumers switch from Mars bars over to Snickers or Milky Way. So there's an increase in the quantity demanded of Snickers or Milky Way, a different product. Or if the price of petrol from BP increases, then the quantity demanded of petrol sold at, I don't know, Mobil or whatever, increases, because these two goods are substitutes. So whenever we find a positive coefficient for cross-price elasticity of demand, we're very, very likely dealing with substitute products. What about this particular case? There's a 1% decrease in the price of the product, and as a result a 5% decrease in the quantity demanded, the decreases being indicated by the negative signs. Well, in that case, we still say that there's a positive or a direct relationship between the price of A and the quantity demanded of B. They're moving in the same direction. When the price of Mars bars falls, negative sign, the quantity demanded of Snickers falls. Consumers who were previously buying Snickers switch over to the now cheaper Mars bars. What about this kind of situation? A 2% increase in the price of good A leads to a 4% decrease in the quantity demanded of good B, a different product. In that case, we've got a coefficient which is negative. A negative over a positive gives you a negative number. We've got a negative of coefficient of 2, meaning for a 1% increase in the price of good A, there's a 2% decrease in the quantity demanded of good B. What kind of relationship must there be between these two products? How do they stand with respect to one another in the minds of consumers? Well, if you think of a concrete example, we were talking about, say, let's stick with the case of petrol and cars. If there were a 2% increase in the price of cars, then presumably there would be a decrease in the quantity demanded of cars. And if there's a decrease in the quantity demanded of cars, then we would expect a decrease in good B, that is, a decrease in the quantity demanded of the complementary good petrol. So when we see a negative coefficient, indicating when the price of one good goes up, the quantity demanded of a different good falls, we know that these two goods must be complementary. In order to enjoy the benefits of one, consumers feel that they should buy the other. So, by businesses empirically investigating cross-price elasticity of demand coefficients, they can discover which firms are producing either close substitutes for their products, or whether there might be some firms who are producing goods which are complementary to their products. And then you can predict what will happen to the quantity demanded for your product based on the price changes that other firms might make. Now, this all might seem relatively dull, and that's understandable, but sometimes cross-price elasticity of demand, the coefficient and the measurement of it, can, get embroiled in political debates. For example, both in Australia and in the United States, and presumably elsewhere, associations that represent the interests of restaurants and food outlets always strenuously argue against increasing minimum wages. And why do they do that? Well, one argument that's sometimes made is that an increase in minimum wages will increase the costs faced by restaurants and other food outlets. And as a result, because the restaurant industry is relatively competitive, it means firms will be compelled to increase their prices to cover their higher costs. But because restaurants then increase their prices to cover their higher costs, consumers will switch from buying restaurant meals to eating at home instead. Now, the truth or falsity of this argument hangs on the cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient. It hangs on the idea that there is a relatively high positive cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient. That is to say, if the price of restaurant meals rise, then it leads to a rise in the quantity demanded of home-prepared meals, which is a substitute, therefore is a substitute by that argument. Now, where it becomes so, cross-price elasticity of demand coefficients and the measurement and estimation of them gets dragged into a political debate about minimum wages. As it turns out, there's, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this in some cases, but there's a number of studies which indicate or suggest that the cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient between restaurant meals and home-prepared meals is actually very, very low. It's close to zero, which implies what? It implies that from the perspective of consumers, restaurant meals and home-prepared meals are not really close substitutes. In which case, the restaurant associations, which argue for no increase in minimum wages, can't use this kind of argument against increasing minimum wages. If you think about, well, if it's just not true, why would that argument get made at all? Well, one possible explanation, and I'm not saying that this is definitively the answer, but one possibility is that if we think of the kinds of businesses which tend to dominate restaurant associations representing the interests of restaurants, the firms which tend to dominate those are, for example, large chains such as McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, Porto in Australia. Those kinds of chains tend to have a disproportionately large voice in these industry associations. More so than the corner store or small independent restaurant. So why would these large chains be making this kind of argument? Well, it might be because it turns out that the cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient is very high with respect to different restaurants. So different restaurants or different food outlets are in competition, they are rivals, and there's a high degree of substitutability in the minds of consumers between different restaurants. Not between restaurants in general and eating at home, but definitely between different restaurants. So, if minimum wage legislation is changed so that there's higher minimum wages, which businesses are pretty much absolutely compelled to follow that law? Well, it's the large chains which are in the public domain that everyone knows about, that have a high profile. They are really compelled to follow the law. They can't escape it. And they will have higher labour costs, and therefore they might have to charge higher prices. But they're competing with whom? They're competing with the small restaurants, the small independent restaurants, which are dotted throughout the whole of the city. And a lot of these restaurants, I think you would find if you did some field research, are, how would we say, a little bit more relaxed when it comes to following the various rules and regulations of industrial relations and workplaces. So in some restaurants and food outlets, you'll find that they don't necessarily adhere to minimum wage legislation, which means that their costs would not go up in comparison to the large food chains, and therefore their prices would not necessarily rise as much compared to the large food chains, and therefore they would gain an advantage in cost terms over their rivals who are in the franchise business. And that perhaps might help to explain why the franchise-dominated restaurant associations are so opposed to increases in minimum wages, because they know that they will face stiffer competition from their independent small rivals who may not follow the legislation in the same way as they do. Anyway, that's all a little bit speculative on my part. Don't take it as gospel truth or anything like that. But it's certainly something you can investigate for yourself. See what you find.